In this video, I'm going to show you how to use this to get the absolute best armor combinations in Destiny 2. Hi, this is my partner Dan.
Wait.
When he plays Destiny 2, he falls into a deep trance, holding in his pee, whispering to himself. One day he turned to me and said,
Hey, how good are you with arrays?
and I said, a raise like a pay raise? And he said,
No, arrays.
and I said, a raise but not a pay raise. And this went on for a while as he missed out on precious raid time and thought about peeing in the corner. So then he showed me what the hell he was on about. He wanted to get the best armor combination to optimize his stats for his hunter character. Each armor item has 6 stats: mobility, resilience, recovery, discipline, intellect, and strength. You can arm yourself with a helmet, gauntlets, chest armor, leg armor, and a hunter cloak, and the stats added up make up your character's total stats. The hunter cloak has 0 stats, and you can only equip one exotic item at a time. So Dan wanted to know the optimal combinations of helmet, gauntlets, chest armor, and leg armor to equip for different scenarios. Now, even though this game had been the bane of my existence, this was a data crunching problem I couldn't pass up. So off Dan went to farm as many different armor items as possible for 2 months. We downloaded the data and I plugged it into my Python notebook. Before we get into the findings, there are a few side notes. 1. There are third-party tools that do this. You plug in the min and max that you want for each stat and it spits out combinations. These calculations are based on sampling and we're not really sure of the methodology. We wanted to see if we could do it unsampled or with a larger sample at least. 2. There are things that you can do to increase the base stats of items, like masterworking and adding mods, which we won't go into in this video. We just kept in the back of our minds that certain stats could be increased after running the analysis on just the base stats. 3. Dan tried to get a wide range and a random sample of items, but the sample is skewed by a few things. Dan had some older items that he'd collected over the 6 months prior to this. He also usually only kept legendary and exotic items, with the exception of a handful of rare items. And there are events in the game that allow Dan to favour a specific stat. So my findings may not be totally representative of the items you have, but the main takeaways should still be relevant. Dan gave me data for 563 different helmet, gauntlets, chest armor, and leg armor items to analyse. This is a curve showing the distribution of mobility stats for the 563 items. It shows you the probability of an item falling within a range of stats. You're most likely to get a mobility stat between 0 and 10, then between 11 and 20, and you're least likely to get between 21 and 30. When we look at all the other stats, visually the curves look very similar. The probabilities vary slightly, but the trend is the same of most likely to least likely. And this is even the case when I broke it down by armor type within each stat. This is a different way of looking at the distributions, and these are the outliers. Statistically speaking, based on how the majority of stats are distributed, the chance of getting these again is less than 1%. I guess this is what the term God roll is all about. Seriously, I had to Google what is a God roll. Next, I looked at the correlations between the stats. If we look at mobility versus resilience and recovery, we can see a trade-off happening. For example, the higher the mobility of an item, the lower the resilience and vice versa. However, if we look at mobility and discipline, an item can have both high mobility and high discipline. The same is true when we look at discipline, intellect, and strength. The stats can therefore be grouped into 2 categories in which the stats compete with each other. This is something Dan had always intuited, but now he had the science to back it up. Of course, this is just looking at individual items. We haven't even looked at any combinations yet, which is how this whole thing started. At the time I did this, Dan had in his vault 88 helmets, 101 gauntlets, 87 chest armor items, and 107 leg armor items, which gives us close to 83 million combinations. This was the most challenging part because my computer didn't have enough memory to perform in-memory calculations on this much data. And I know no one was asking for it, but I wanted to crunch all 83 million combinations. So here's what I wanted to do. I had data on each item which I grouped into 4 tables by their armor type. Each item had a unique ID so you could distinguish between items with the same name but different stats. This came in handy because it meant I could run the 83 million combinations using this one string variable. Once I had all the possible combinations of every Armour item, I needed to be able to filter and compare them with each other, and have Dan be able to tell which items the IDs referred to. So I merged the original data of all the items, the item names, tiers and stats, with the 83 million rows. Then I could filter out the combinations with more than one exotic item, and filter and rank them for specific conditions to find the optimal combinations. Producing the 83 million combinations of each ID ran relatively quickly. Merging the original 4 tables with it was the hard part. Running it on my computer with only 8 gigs of memory, it f***ing died. Not ideal. When I cleared up some more disk space, it took over half an hour to run. That was an improvement. Then I tested it on a few more computers, and even with 64 gigs of memory, it still took 6 minutes to run, which felt incredibly wasteful for what we were trying to do. Then I read about a Python package that promised to solve exactly this problem. As long as the data can fit on your hard drive, tick, the pandas-like package can crunch up to 1 billion rows per second, tick, in a memory-efficient way. Oh my god! Roll. And sure enough, after half a day of playing around with it and rewriting my code 7 times, it ran on my computer in a little under 3 minutes. Praise be! Okay, so what if instead of getting combinations for every item, we just pick the top 30, 40, or 50 of each Armour type? This would be sampling, and at this point it seemed like the most sensible thing to do. With a few pre-calculations, we can cut down the number of combinations from 83 million to something like 6 million, get the same result, and the savings in time and computer processing are significant. But how do you select a sample without missing out on potentially awesome combinations? How do you know what the optimal sample size is? I ran an experiment to test this. Let's say I wanted the top items for the highest recovery and the next highest mobility. I calculated a weighted score where I placed more importance on recovery and ranked by this. Then I could take the same top number of items from each Armour type as samples. I tested sample sizes of 80 through to 20 and looked at the distribution of recovery and mobility for each lot of samples. You can see that as sample size decreases, even though items with the highest recovery make it through each time, fewer items with high mobility make it through. Which didn't end up mattering anyway because the high mobility items weren't what we needed for max recovery and high mobility, but more on that later. Sample sizes of 80 through to 30 gave us the exact same result as the unsampled calculation for top combinations. It was only when I got down to a sample size of 20 did I get a different result. For me, finding the optimal sample size was a balance between erring on the side of wanting to include as many items as possible versus runtime. So going back to this third-party tool, it's totally understandable why they've selected this sample size for a browser-based app. From here, it was smooth sailing, building models for combinations based on what Dan wanted to achieve in different situations. This is what he wanted.
For regular play, I want to maximize and get 100 in both mobility and recovery. Master working adds +10 to each stat. Mods for mobility are cheaper to use than mods for recovery. So I only need the base stats to get me most of the way there.
Okay, so let's ignore that last bit for a sec. If for argument's sake, Dan wanted the highest possible total base stats for both mobility and recovery, I would weight both stats equally, pick the top 50 items from each Armour type as samples, run the combinations, and get rid of the combinations that had more than one exotic. And this is the total base mobility and recovery for each combination. The pink and purple area in the middle is where most of the combinations sit, but we would actually care about the combinations here to maximize both stats. And these would be the top 5 combinations. Now, going back to Dan's criteria, he wants to prioritize recovery-based stats because he has mods that will give him a bigger increase in mobility and it won't take up as much mod space. So here I weighted recovery higher, and you can see the distribution of the total base stats now skews to recovery. I ran a few different models to give Dan some options to test different mods on top. So I started with recovery at least 70, then mobility as high as possible, which ended up being in the mid-50s. You can see that resilience is really low because of that trade-off, and there are some nice options for discipline, intellect, and strength for Dan to pick and choose. Here's what recovery at least 80 looks like. and recovery at least 90. Dan really liked this one.
So this is a good combination for mobility and recovery. So once all the items have been masterworked, there'll be plus 10 for each of them. So recovery is going to hit 100, mobility will be 40. We then have the plus 20 mobility mod. So I can use 4 of the 5 remaining mod slots for stats. And there's a backrest helmet in this one.
But for PvE, Dan really wanted to use this particular item.
So for PvE, I want to use the Stompy's exotic item because of its unique perk, which makes me run, move, jump faster, higher, etc.
So we built this into the model, and this was the best combination for the highest mobility and recovery, then discipline, intellect, and strength.
For PvP, I want 100 in both resilience and recovery, but again, the base stats only need to get me most of the way there.
Okay, so same deal. I weighted resilience and recovery equally, and these were the top 5 combinations for both being as high as possible. But ultimately, Dan decided he wanted to use this particular item, and this was the best combination. So after all of that, here are my top takeaways for farming armor in Destiny 2. 1. The distribution of stats across stat types and armor types is similar. Identify which 1 or 2 stats you want to prioritize, and the following strategies can apply. 2. There is a trade-off in stats between mobility, resilience, and recovery, and discipline, intellect, and strength. Know what to prioritize in each group and across both groups. 3. Items with mid-range stats for 2 stat types in one group are the most versatile and efficient. This is what made up most of our top combinations, where we wanted to prioritize 2 competing stats at a time, and that's why it's okay that not all of the highest stat items of a secondary stat are selected in our samples. You're also 10 times more likely to find these than items with 1 or 2 god roll stats. If you look for these, the highest I saw was 16 and 16. 4. Almost as rare as god rolls were items with mid-range stats for 2 stat types in both groups. If you find this, or a god roll, hold on to these because they are rare. 5. There was only 1 item with 2 god roll stats, making this the rarest item yet. If you find something like this, get down on your knees and pray. And that concludes my findings on Destiny 2 armor stats. Who knew we could enjoy this game together? I'd love to hear from you guys. Have you observed anything similar or different from your armor items? Have you encountered the same memory issue I had working with large datasets and in-memory calculations? Do you have a more efficient way to crunch the top combinations? Anyways, this has been Did Someone Say Data?, where I try to solve problems outside the box with data. If you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing. This is a brand new channel and every little bit will help. I haven't validated this, but it may increase your chances of finding god rolls. Just try it.